Hello there, good evening. You're watching the press preview. It's the first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half an hour, we're going to be seeing what is making the headlines. That's with the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and columnist at the article Ali Miraj. Well, let's see what is on some of those front pages. All of the papers, as you might expect, are leading on the invasion of Ukraine. The Times has a picture of people taking cover in Kiev as an air raid siren sounds, with the headline, "Terror Stalks the Streets." The Sunday Telegraph says fierce resistance by the Ukrainians has slowed down the Russian advance into their country. And the Star has a picture of Ukraine's president, who has vowed to stay and fight. The Mirror says the Ukrainians have managed to hold on to their capital city despite the presence of Russian troops on the outskirts. "Fight to the death" is the headline for The Sun. And the Express says Ukraine's forces have won praise from ministers, and even members of the royal family have expressed their support for the people of Ukraine. Freedom fighters, that is how the People describes the Ukrainian forces. And Vladimir Putin is facing growing isolation. That's as many former allies have turned against him. That is on the front of the Observer. A reminder that by scanning the QR code that you can see on the screen during the programme, you can also check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. Well, tonight we are joined by Rachel Shabi and Ali Miraj. A very good evening to both of you. Before we start getting into the front pages, really, I just want to get a reflection from both of you. Perilous times in Ukraine, the people in the capital city, including many journalists, many Sky News journalists as well, waiting. The city administration has sounded an alert there, unknown and perilous times ahead. Your reflections, Rachel?
It's absolutely horrifying to watch, I think, for all of us watching these scenes. It's just appalling to see this happen in Ukraine, to see a nation be terrorized by a military invasion in this way is deeply upsetting. And just, heart goes out to people who are living in these conditions, facing this appalling bombardment from Russia. And also having to flee their own country. We've seen, thousands upon thousands of people desperate to leave the country, women, children, long queue of people leaving, seeking refuge in Poland. Obviously, we have a responsibility now to keep our borders open to anybody who needs them at this horrendous time.
And Ali, your thoughts on war in Europe?
Well, it's a very, very poignant moment, and our thoughts and prayers and good wishes are with the stoical people of Ukraine, who are, for all intents and purposes, mounting quite a fight, which is in really stark contrast. I mean, look, Vladimir Zelensky is a comedian. Well, he's leading from the front here, and you can't help contrast the way he's behaving with the approach taken by Ashraf Ghani, the president of Afghanistan last year, when as the Taliban were closing in on Kabul, scarpered in a plane, allegedly with oodles of cash, a claim which he denies. The contrast could not be more stark. So very, very difficult times, as Rachel said. I passed the Russian embassy earlier today, and there was a lot of solidarity there and thoughts for the people of Ukraine.
Rachel, let's look at the front page of the Sunday Telegraph. Fierce resistance slows Putin's advance in Ukraine. It's a pretty dogged resistance, isn't it, being put up, not just by Ukrainian military, but by normal people, civilians.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And if, the reports are that Putin was expecting a sort of lightning invasion, well, that's not what this is. And that's because, in no small part, to this huge resistance, as you say, civilian as well as military, outsmarting Putin's forces. Very sort of nifty, scrappy civilian operation, seems to be outwitting Russian troops and tanks, diverting them so that, ensuring that they get lost, thwarting them. Russian forces themselves are also not doing a great job, apparently, needing to be refueling more than they need to be, and not managing to do this swift invasion that perhaps Putin had hoped for. So it is, absolutely extraordinary. And it does seem to be just regular people getting engaged in this. We saw earlier scenes of just people who normally would be working 9 to 5, packing Molotov cocktails by day now. And it has to be said that this is what resistance looks like. We're seeing it in Ukraine, but of course, this is what happens in other countries as well that face an illegal military invasion of this sort.
Yeah, Ali, Vladimir Putin won't have figured on this not going to plan, will he? Particularly not when you consider the might of the Russian military.
Well, the Russians have been building up their military forces for the past decade, and they've also been trying to insulate themselves from the effects of sanctions as well. But Vladimir Putin looks like he's got a fight on his hands. I still think it's going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to resist this indefinitely, although we wish them the very best, and they're fighting very, very hard. And what the West can do is to provide arms and provide whatever support it can in terms of punitive sanctions to the people of Ukraine. But yes, certainly it's not going exactly to plan for Putin, but ultimately he has got an air force as well. On top of this, now that may not be as useful in hand-to-hand kind of combat in cities. We'll have to wait and see. But the West should do whatever it can, short of putting boots on the ground itself, to support the people of Ukraine.
Ukrainian media, Rachel, reporting that an air attack is imminent on the capital city tonight. The front page of The Sun says simply, "Fight to the death."
You know, it's really, really hard. I mean, I'm not a Ukraine expert, I should say that up front, but just talking to the geopolitics of this. I mean, I think Ali signposted that a moment ago, that, we are looking at Russia is a huge military force, nuclear-powered force. Ukraine is not. Now, it's not a NATO member, and nobody is sending troops to help fight. So that being the case, I mean, of course, absolute solidarity with Ukraine, but it is also hard to see how this ends quickly. I think what we're looking at is what we often look at when we see a military invasion. We saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Afghanistan, is that people resist. Of course they do. Nobody wants to be occupied. Palestinians certainly don't want to be occupied. Resistance is what happens, but it also can be a very long, drawn-out affair. And I don't say that with any satisfaction, that this may actually drag on for a while.
Ali, let's talk about the front page of The Star. We won't run and hide. Of course, some of the most powerful testimony, and there has been a lot of it, hasn't there, since this started a mere 3 days ago, has come from President Zelensky himself. He said President Biden offered him a way out of the country. He said, "I don't want to ride, I need ammunition."
Yeah, very untypical for the US to be dealing with someone who actually has got the guts and the courage to stand and fight and lead his people in that direction. Highly untypical for them, given their recent experience, particularly, as I mentioned, in Afghanistan. But look, Vladimir Zelensky is not only leading from the front. I saw him with a rifle earlier, but also posting social media videos to try and bolster his people, to get the message out to the outside world of exactly what's going on the ground, and also conducting successive calls with world leaders, including Boris Johnson, who he thanked on Twitter this evening. So he's doing well in the communication stakes, as well as leading from the front. But I think Rachel touched on the geopolitics of this, and I think there are really 2 points that are a wake-up call for the West here. The first is that we, over the last 30-odd years, since the end of the Cold War, have really not invested enough in defense. If you look at UK defense spending, we spent about 4% in 1989 on defense. We now spend about 2% of GDP on it. Could say the same for the NATO allies, who are really admonished by President Trump, of all people, about not spending enough on NATO's defense. And the second thing is, we've been all caught with our a little bit napping here, asleep at the wheel, not so much the UK, but certainly Germany and parts of Europe, who are very heavily dependent on Russia for their energy security. 50% of all oil and gas imports into Germany come from Russia. And this is exactly why, when it comes to sanctions, the energy sector has been excluded from sanctions, because large parts of Europe have got no choice but to take Russian gas. And that is a strategic error that has been made, which we're now paying the price for. And the final thing to say is that flirting with Ukrainian membership of NATO is the worst of all worlds. NATO allies, back in 2008, Ukraine asked to be, or put forward a request to be a member of NATO. NATO refused because it had no desire to engage in a hot war on the border with Russia. But now entertaining it is the worst of all worlds. You don't have the Ukrainians in NATO, and you don't have them outside NATO. I mean, it's just a mess at the moment, quite frankly. So I think geopolitically, we've got a lot of navel gazing to do, and we've got to really kind of get real and strategically wean ourselves off Russian gas.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about it being a mess there, Ali. Rachel, on the front of the Sunday Times, the Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, tells us that we need to prepare for 10 years of conflict there. Do you view it as intractable as that?
I think potentially, yes. And look, I pray I'm wrong. I'm not a Ukraine expert, and I pray that I've got this really wrong and that it is swift. But we are looking at a dynamic that doesn't suggest that. Ukraine is an independent country. It does not deserve and did not ask to be caught in a crossfire of, a kind of Cold War rehash. But it is, unfortunately, has been dragged into this geopolitical situation. And I agree with Ali to some extent that it's to do with Western dependency on gas and oil from Russia. But I think that's just a piece in a bigger puzzle that's decades old, that has made situations like this so intractable. We're looking at, Russian oligarchs who fund our current conservative government. We're looking at a neoliberal system that has rewarded, a sort of kleptocracy in Russia. We're looking at a failing UN that is unable to prevent this sort of thing. We're looking at a failing NATO that has not acted properly in the last 30 years. We're looking at terrible precedents of invasions set by Western powers in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's all of that, all of it together, that makes this so messy and so difficult.
I mean, the UK comes in for a lot of criticism here, doesn't it, Ali, about extricating itself from dependence on Russian money and oligarchs' money. The front page of the Sunday Mirror features the story that broke this evening about Roman Abramovich quitting running Chelsea. Was that your read of it? It's quite a complicated statement, what's actually going on there with his ownership. Just briefly.
Well, it looks like Roman Abramovich has been a very activist owner of his football club over the last 19 years. He takes an active interest in it. He's involved in the day-to-day management of it, including appointing managers and also indeed player hiring decisions as well. So he is very activist. He sees this as a way of protecting his own football club, but also potentially protecting the fact that he does not want his asset taken away from him. Now, as to what his relationship is with Putin, I mean, that's something that will be determined in due course. But I think from his perspective, it's a sensible move to make. He's put it in the hands of the Chelsea Charitable Foundation so that the football club is not affected. It's number 3 in the Premiership at the moment. They're having a decent season, although one of their forwards has not been performing up to standard so far. So I think from his perspective, it's just a sensible move.
Okay, all right. Rachel, Ali, plenty more for us to be talking about next hour. So we'll see you guys. We'll see you guys at 11:30. Thank you very much for now.